Gracias, Gastón, por la introducción al panel. En verdad, típicamente tenemos que defender este tópico y explicar por qué es importante, pero en este congreso, gracias al trabajo también del equipo de APP, esa justificación no es más necesaria. Es claro que el manejo de estos riesgos lleva a resultados mejores, a proyectos eficientes, y como lo mencionaste, Gastón, no es solo un tema de APPs, es un tema que trae la importancia de la coordinación entre la decisión de inversión, qué proyecto hacemos y si hacemos estos proyectos y cómo lo hacemos, si lo procuramos como APP, como posiciones o otra manera. Y así está estructurado el panel. Mariana Silva, que es una profesional de infraestructura sostenible y consultora en la división de cambio climático, va a presentar el estudio que mencionaba Gastón, hecho con INEFCO. Y después tenemos un panel muy de alto nivel, presentando experiencias de la región con Diana Cardona de la ANI en Colombia, vicepresidenta de estructuración, Gabriel Dali, director general de inversión privada en el Ministerio de Finanzas y Economía del Perú, Ricardo Murro, que es gerente de la división de APP y planificación del Banco de Desarrollo de Jamaica, que es unidad APP en el país, y también una experiencia internacional con Ede Gias, que es Senior Advisor en el Global Center for Adaptation. El panel va a hablar inglés y español, esperamos, pero hay traducción, entonces esperamos que todos puedan aprovechar. Mariana, por favor.
Muchas gracias, Jean-Leo. Como lo mencionó Jean-Leo, es un honor estar aquí. Nuestro panel es multilingüe, entonces voy a pasar en un momento a presentar en inglés. Por favor, los que requieran traducción simultánea pueden encontrarla abajo de su página del lado derecho. So I'm very excited today, as Gaston and Jean-Leo mentioned, the importance of environmental social components in the development in PPPs. Those of you that have followed the sustainability agenda and the climate change agenda could witness that it has gained a lot of traction over the past months, not only the year. We listened of the EU and Korea pledged that they're going to go net zero by 2050, China following by 2060. The US Fed has joined the NCFS, which is the Network of Financial System Regulators, introducing climate risk with more than 86 central banks. And we have more and more private sector company also in the infrastructure space joining TCFD, that is Disclosure for Climate Change. So this is an agenda here to stay, and it's getting a lot of traction internationally. So it's very important. I'm very happy to share with you a study that we did together with my colleague Ancor Suarez Aleman from the PPP unit and INECO Consulting in Colombia, where we wanted to deeply understand what are we doing in Latin America in terms of sustainability and what could we do better, understand this cause-effect relationship. But for that, a little bit of background. At IDB, we have a sustainable infrastructure framework that says our definition. And I wanted to make an important point of why is sustainability important for PPPs in Latin America. The sustainability is key, but also infrastructure is the backbone of the economy. It's the service that is as well going to help the recovery after the COVID-19 crisis. And as well, the decisions that we make for infrastructure is going to set the pathway if as a region, we achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and the agreement. So in this report, we actually zoom into the environmental and climate change components and the social sustainability with a special focus on land acquisition and property. And as I said before, infrastructure is a very important sector nowadays. And for you that are familiar with the climate change agenda, you know that infrastructure services emit 50% of global CO2 emissions, services of construction, operation, maintenance. So that means that if we continue to invest in infrastructure, there's no way that we're going to achieve the net zero agenda and the Paris alignment. But at the same time, on another study developed by Ancor and Thomas Erebrisky from IDB, they calculated that if our region, Latin America and the Caribbean, doesn't invest enough over the next 10 years in infrastructure, they could lose 50% of GDP growth. and they calculated that the infrastructure gap in a region was 200 billion per year. So it's not about not investing to develop better services, it's about choosing the right infrastructure and structuring the right projects. And for that, sustainability becomes key for infrastructure delivery services and PPPs. And so with that context in mind, we wanted to deeply understand what was happening in the region and what we could do better. So very quickly, what we did is looked at Colombia, Costa Rica, Chile, Mexico, and Peru pipeline of projects. And we selected 750 PPP projects and 989 traditional infrastructure investment. And I put a box here because we really channel all this data, analyze it. We funnel it looking at what was the investment size of the project, what were the sectors, the type of the project, the access of the quality information. And also we wanted to keep a diversified range of sectors, from energy to water and sanitation, to transport and social infrastructure. So from all that, we channeled to 65 projects to have as a sample for the study, where 45 of them were PPP and 21 were traditional public procurement. So we started broader and then we narrowed it down. And I'm going to put the link to the report in a moment, but I want to fast forward to the study results. So now we have established that sustainability is key. We have to invest more. We did this sample with 65 projects, and there were two main outcomes I'm going to cover very quickly. The first one is that there's a business case for sustainability. Impossible to argue the contrary. From all these 65 projects, all of them encounter some type of conflict, either social or environmental or land conflict. Those that encounter land conflict, they had cost overrun of average 80% of total budgeted. So it costed 80% more than initially expected because of those conflicts of property. On environmental conflicts, we saw a wider range from 15% to 70% cost of overrun to delays from 12 months to 13 years. So wide spectrum, but still very expensive, very delays. And from social conflicts, there were cost overrun between 11% to 68%. So in other words, if these projects would have been structured looking at these environmental and social components correctly since the beginning, they could have avoided all these delays and this extra cost. That's the result number one. The second one, we wanted as well to understand a little bit about how was this managed in different contractual agreements between being a PPP and traditional procurement. And we look at this in detail in the report, but just briefly to mention, on environmental license, it was interesting to observe that when the government got the license rights, and then it was transferred to the private sector had a harder time not breaching the contract because they were not involved since the beginning. On PPPs, we observed that they had a holistic view and for the entire life cycle, so they obtained license better and then they were less breached. Same for risk management. Private sector looked at the entire risk across the life cycle, and they were able to allocate it efficiently, including issues of climate change, some of them, and changes in legislation. And finally, for land acquisition, we saw that the state was much more better equipped to deal with issues of resettlement and then transfer it to the private sector concessionaire. So all in all, there were trade-offs, but it was very powerful, the message that PPPs are a very strong and powerful tool to deliver sustainable infrastructure for our region. And so the report goes and provides policy implication and recommendation that I'm not going to cover right now. As a last in this message, I want to tell you that the change is already happening, and we already are very honored to have with us in the panel that Jean-Leo will moderate some key leaders and key thoughtful leaders on this. From strategy and tools, we have the climate resilient toolkit that Jean-Leo developed and I developed, that it's about how do we support decision makers and the PPPs to actually incorporate climate change analysis and risk mitigation across the entire life cycle of a PPP, from project identification, business case, transaction, and then monitoring of the contract. From the planning, we're going to hear from Gabriel Dalí from the Ministry of Finance of Peru, how IDB had the honor to support the journey to develop a national infrastructure plan that was looking into sustainability and looking at climate change components very upstream, making like a much solid pipeline. From project prioritization, we have been working with the Ministry of Finance of Mexico, helping them to develop a methodology that will help them prioritize those projects, those infrastructure projects, that will be more sustainable and yield higher social and environmental components, helping them with the COVID-19 recovery and push their GDP growth. And then finally, we're helping with the National Infrastructure Fund in Mexico to restructure as the first national sustainable infrastructure fund, helping structure PPPs and incorporate all these components more soundly. And with the ANI as well, that we have the honor to have them present here, we're helping them with that dashboard for them to identify what PPPs are sustainable and which others have more areas of opportunity. So the agenda is already being mainstream across the region in a very powerful way. So with that in mind, and not to exceed the time allocation that I have today, I just want to close with restating three key takeaway messages that I want you to take away today. One of them is that sustainability is key for the world, but especially for LAC. They need to deliver infrastructure services, but at the same time, the correct ones that they're sustainable. The second one is sustainability is not a cost. Oftentimes with the Ministry of Finance, when we mention sustainability, there's hesitation about extra burdens, complexity, and cost, but the reality is that the study resoundingly proved that it was a savings versus a cost. And then finally, and the perfect segue to give back the word to Janleo, is that sustainability is a reality already, and we're about to hear more about the leaders in the region implementing this. So with that, Janleo, back to you.
Gracias, Mariana, y gracias por estar en el tiempo presentando.
Thank you very much, Mariana, and thank you for just compressing so much information in such a short amount of time. So now we are going to underscore in this panel discussing these topics. And the new infrastructure plan under leadership of the Ministry of Finance, and it's basically supported by two pillars: the integration of environmental issues, and maybe you could let us know, you could discuss exactly how these topics, how these priorities in terms of planning, and how is the plan supporting the pipeline of sustainable projects. And what are some of the takeaways? What are some of the challenges for our colleagues who are considering and working in similar initiatives? Well, good morning, and it's a pleasure to be here working with the IDB. The infrastructure plan started with Mariana, with significant support from the IDB a few years ago. And I was, in this case, I'd like to share some of our experiences in Peru. Peru did not have an infrastructure plan, and there were 3 or 4 triggers that determined the need to establish a plan, and they're closely associated with our discussion today. First of all, when we look at there were quite a few implications in the financial aspects, but in 2017, we had the El Niño coastline that had a significant impact throughout the country. And we also had significant delays in terms of infrastructure development, especially highway infrastructure and building the metro, because of the lack of adequate access to property and land. So those were the negatives. But looking at the positives, we began to see, as a result of the Pan American Games, a major push thanks to support by the British government. And so we decided to launch our first infrastructure plan. We had, for example, a Central Planning Institute that was created in the late 60s. And together with that, we realized that the IDB had studies indicating that Latin America was one of the most severely affected regions because of climate change, and this pattern would continue in the future. And as we look at we looked at some of the plans from Australia and the UK. The issue of sustainability in the face of climate change was very closely and significantly incorporated in infrastructure development initiatives. So the decision was made to launch the plan and include the concept in that planning process. So a great deal of effort was made with the Ministry of the Environment in trying to really clearly define the concept as well as the variables. So once we prioritized an infrastructure initiative, so the hypothesis that we worked with was that all those projects with the greatest impact in terms of sustainability needed to be scaled up in order to be eligible to be included. So the process moved pretty quickly, and we weren't able to include the variable within the agenda of priorities, but we began to see a great deal of traction, and we began to prioritize this component within the plan. And the methodology it's something that we're still working on in terms of identifying indicators and how we identified the variables in each project. And we had a clear commitment that we needed to incorporate this. This logic was discussed in the Council of Ministers. There was a resolution that was issued, and that included putting sustainability on the agenda. And in Peru, we had an open process that lasted 9 months, where we had 450 meetings held with over 800 stakeholders. So this was discussed at length, and there was a general agreement established of including this as a priority. And although at the time we weren't able to include the variable in the methodology, we actually used 12 variables. The recommendations of the government of the UK was to have 32 variables. But because of lack of information, this was not possible. Despite this, we did include projects with significant sustainability components, and a special effort was made to include it, because when projects are entering into competitive bidding, when we look at social benefit considerations, that's not going to perhaps compete with the treatment plans, for example. So we wanted to make sure that we could include them in the plan. So we have in the plan, we have, for example, 10 water treatment plants for Lake Titicaca. We included also as part of the packages the management of solid waste, and also we have another plan that needs to expand some water treatment facilities in Lima, and also the expansion of the Lima metro system, a metro line that has been seen as somewhat chaotic to serve the needs of 10 million people. And so we're looking at some of the issues relating to emissions, for example. So the plan, in addition to the environmental concerns, not just in Peru, but throughout the region, we also have the concerns related to land acquisitions. And one thing that we've changed, because the plan, it's just not a wish list. It's a series of discussions that involve the investment, private sector investment stakeholders, the government investment components, and there was a series of standards established that could help enhance the processes much further. And And so what we have seen with the infrastructure plan, we've been able to, as I said, increase efficiencies in some of these processes to make them much more appropriate for our needs. So in the area of land acquisition, for example, we PPP needs to include in its planning a land acquisition component, at least at 80% of the land that's already that would be required for the projects. Therefore, overall, the message and the concept, I think, is closely rooted in Peru to these concerns. It's been incorporated in the infrastructure plan. There are projects that we know need to be included, and there's still quite a bit of work ahead of us. The plan needs to be reviewed, especially now that we are on the eve of elections. But again, this is a work that's going to require fine-tuning the tools as well as the variables as we move along. That's all I had to cover. Thank you, Gabriel. And you've touched on two key areas, and that is that not all the projects are just going to be having participation by private sector. We have to see what also serves the needs of government, and then also the risks. We need to prepare sustainable projects to help the countries in the region to attract external capital, external investors like the European investors and investors from throughout the rest of the region. So the investment market, investment in infrastructure has to be helping the sustainability. So the region has to be better at marketing to attract these investors. I just want to remind everyone that we do have a Q&A session, and we're going to try to set aside about 10 minutes for discussion for some very brief questions. All you have to do is either press the Q&A button, or you can even put it into the chat. So now let's move on to Ricardo Monroe. Ricardo?
To climate change and extreme events. It's like, you work in Jamaica, you live in Jamaica, a country that is very exposed to climate change, to extreme events. And you are sitting in the PPP unit where you actually see the project and need to structure them for the private participation. We've been working together on a couple of things that I'd like you to comment, both looking at the policy and of the country, but also the processes of DBJ to include resiliency in your daily life. So just talk us through what have been the improvements and what is the work in progress in Jamaica, both upstream and downstream. We've been looking at it as a whole life cycle of the project, and what have been for you the main challenges of working on this new topic, let's say less traditional topic, but also the benefits that you might actually be seeing already. Thank you, Ricardo.
Sure. Thank you, John Leo. Thank you to the panelists as well. So in 2020, in October and November, Jamaica experienced adverse weather due to two hurricanes, Zeta and Eta. And these two storms, although they didn't impact the country directly because they were much to the northwest of us, we suffered damage in the range of US $50 million. And the storms damaged about 280 roads in the country. And I think as a result of that, I mean, we have never really experienced in recent times having, enough rain in 2 months that covers what would normally be a year of rain in Jamaica. So policymakers and politicians started to talk about, how to make our road infrastructure in particular more resilient. And I was heartened by it because then it signaled to me that there was more awareness that something different is happening and it's impacting us negatively. I mean, cumulatively, the adverse weather and climate conditions can account for up to 2% of GDP in Jamaica on a year-on-year basis. So I think there's more of an awareness now, and I'm going to borrow a term that Mariana mentioned earlier, that what we're trying to do here at the Development Bank of Jamaica in the PPP unit is that we're trying to develop a sustainable infrastructure framework. And I borrowed that term from Mariana. But as you said, John Leo, this framework that we're trying to develop now, it involves updating our PPP policy so that it focuses on climate resiliency deliberately. We're focusing on, equipping our partners, ourselves at the BBJ with the tools necessary to execute projects with climate resiliency in mind. And thirdly, we're trying to build a network. So we're not, trying to do this on our own. We realize that there are expertise spread across the government and even in the private sector. And we're trying to bring the partners and parties together so that we can come up with sensible solutions to the problems that we're having. So yes, we did a study in 2019, as you briefly mentioned, and we found a couple of things. Climate change was not mentioned in our PPP policy at all, right? We realized also that there has been mitigation measures present in most of our PPP projects, which were under contract, but these measures were not specifically developed for climate resilience per se. They were developed in a broader context of managing general environmental risks. And we also realized from the study that, there are a number of players in Jamaica who are now more concerned about climate resilience and are working actively to develop policy, legislative framework, and expertise across government. I mean, I can name a few outside of the Development Bank of Jamaica who are thinking about this, are the Climate Division that was in the Office of the Prime Minister. We have the National Environmental Planning Agency, who have programs sensitizing people about climate change, and the Planning Institute of Jamaica. So we found that we had common partners, and what we're trying to do now, as you mentioned in the toolkit that we have, we're trying to operationalize the practice. So here in the PPP unit, we have already begun to utilize the toolkit in developing the current stream of projects that we have, so that in 2 years or 3 years from now, we'll have a stock of PPP projects that we can say have a stamp that can be labeled climate resilient PPPs. So we are also trying to work with our partners, as I said, in utilizing this toolkit. This toolkit is not exclusively for the use of the PPP unit here in Jamaica. It is something that is going to be used by the Ministry of Finance. It will be used by NEPA and some other agencies who will now be more involved in the process of developing PPP. So just a little bit about the toolkit. The toolkit covers the entire project cycle that we have for PPPs and described in the policy. So from project identification, development of the business case, the transaction stage, and contract management. So we're trying to cover the full gamut that exists, and to ensure that climate resilience is among the criteria that we use to assess projects and to monitor their performance over time. So that's what we're doing in respect of the upstream work. I mean, I can say confidently that, in 2 years from now, we'll have projects that have that stamp. And on the policy side, we're actually currently updating our PPP policy to ensure that climate resilience is a theme and a criterion in the whole policy framework. So some of the benefits of the toolkit, John, you asked about the benefits and challenges. I think a couple of benefits are that, one, we'll have a reference guide that is relatable. So when we were doing the research, I mean, we found information across the world that was, usable, but it did not relate to our specific context, being a Caribbean island, and with the legal and governmental framework that we have. So we now have something that we can relate to. It is specific to our processes and our policies and the setup of our government. So that is helpful. And then secondly, we have a tool that will provide a guide to users at each stage. So they'll know how to use the tools and when to use the tools. And that will be critical for the role that we will play. I'm going to describe the role that we play as part of the challenges though. We have to convince our stakeholders in the government to utilize the toolkit. And that means we have to go out there to sensitize them, to train them. And DBJ has emerged as a focal point for climate resilience here in Jamaica. I mean, people are calling us almost every week trying to get our thoughts and input on different aspects of climate resilience. And that is a good thing. We don't shy away from this responsibility, but it brings on the burden for us, because our main focus is developing projects, and we have emerged as this repository of knowledge, if you will, and we have to train our staff in order to meet that demand. And we are also looking at bringing on specialists in the area of climate resilience in our unit, so that we know that we have the capacity to respond to what is needed. Political buy-in is a big issue still. I mean, although there's some evidence that people are more aware about the impact of climate change and want to move in a direction that makes our infrastructure more resilient, there is still the thinking that to do this, it will cost more. It will cost the government more in terms of capex, and maybe even assuming liabilities on the PPP project. And I think Mariana said it earlier that it's probably how we present information to people. So we need to play a role now in telling people about the value. I mean, value for money specifically, because there can be savings, as she eloquently said, and we just need to show empirically that is the case. And when we're doing the business cases, to be more deliberate about performing those assessments that prove the value for money for including resiliency measures in the development of our PPP projects. Another thing that will be a challenge, I mean, we haven't seen it yet, but in further downstream, when we're at the stage of marketing our transactions and closing projects, we want to ensure that there's adequate financing for projects that have a resiliency stamp. And that means we'll have to reach out to the local private sector, namely the financial community in Jamaica, to sensitize them about this initiative and why it is better to invest in a PPP project that is resilient than one that is not so developed. And also multilateral partners. We are going to also need blended financing to ensure that there is an adequate suite of financing available for different types of projects and different levels of risk. So that is something that, again, we are trying to lead in Jamaica on. Specifically, the DBJ is trying to seek accreditation with the Green Climate Fund. And, we have seen in recent times where local banks are becoming more aware of climate resiliency. So I think that's it, Janio. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricardo. Always a great pleasure to see you. Vamos con Colombia la próxima, como con Diana.
Colombia is next. Colombia is an interesting case because of the multi-annual experience in projects and high-level concessions, and it is now undergoing a major change from the fourth to fifth generation with a program that will more explicitly include environmental and sustainability components. And this will expand from the road sector to other sectors as well. Can you perhaps tell us then in just 5 minutes, let's say, the experience in Colombia, the lessons learned throughout these years of work with concessions, and what are the main changes with 5G and the new work you're doing to ensure sustainability in the country? What should we expect and what should we be able to see coming out of these projects, also with regard to the management of risks, among other considerations? Thank you very much. A good morning to all of you. I will try to keep my remarks brief, given the limited time we have to tell our story, which reflects developments in Colombia in recent years, which have been very significant, especially in the field of road concessions with 4 generations. Actually, we're into the 5th generation already. And here we have also many other areas that had not been as strong in the past with private participation, such as the river infrastructure, including the dam and also the connection between the railways and the ports. So based on lessons learned, there are many of them. I will try to provide a summary. Up to the 3rd generation, there was no legal framework for PPPs. Colombia finally had a legal framework in 2012 with a law that was subsequently amended by another, and the institutional structure wasn't really strong. There wasn't a sound institutional framework either to make these projects succeed. So in the early generations, especially in the first one and then second and third generations, there was the combined effect of not having strong institutions and not having a good legal framework. So risk allocation had its shortcomings. There wasn't clarity with regard to environmental, social, and property related risks, which are so important in these projects. And especially, there was a lack of resources in the technical structuring of projects. There wasn't much investment in engineering. So the projects used to come out without proper phase 2 or subsequent more advanced studies. So the projects encountered many problems because you had to sort out things on an as-you-go basis. And some projects that are already 20 years old are still in the construction phase. And this has been one thing we have learned and built into the 4th generation. When it began, there was Law 1508, which is the PPP law that governs Colombia, in addition to an institutional reform. The government at the time sought to create an entity that would specifically deal with PPP transport projects in all modes, making this truly sound and strong. And another important thing is that for the first time, significant resources were invested in engineering. So the due diligence and engineering studies were performed and the contract for roads was standardized. This was very important so that PPP contracts finally had very clear rules and specific points and also appendices were including the contracts to provide for these environmental, social, and property related issues, which was a novelty. Policy guidelines are also important in Colombia. We had some older rules, but we developed some specific new regulations dealing with risk allocation and putting in place clear rules for the purposes of allocating property-related network and environmental risks, setting out how the risks should be shared and what should be assumed by the private and what by the private and government side by sharing, and also instances in which the private would take care of all risks. So we had 29 projects put out for tender. Most of them, well, some of them have actually completed the construction phase. That was also standardized. A year or a year and a half was given, depending on project complexity, for the pre-construction phase. These are all of the activities that you need before you start with construction. Having the property availability, having the environmental licenses, the social issues, that has to be done during the first year. And only when that first year work on the contract was completed did the construction phase begin, with some 5 years to build all the works. And the law also created a functional unit which has to do with the segments or tranches of each project, which should serve a purpose. It shouldn't just be public works. It should serve a functional purpose and conform to quality services and to certain standards of service. And then you get paid accordingly. And as from year 5, you go into the commissioning, which usually runs into the 25th year of operation as well. There is always room for improvement, and we always draw on lessons learned and improve as we go. We are now in the 5th generation of concessions. We are working with the government of Colombia with a whole of government approach to come up with a policy document dealing with the 5th generation of concessions, seeking greater sustainability for projects in terms of sustainability, the environmental matters, property-related issues, as well as financial and institutional ones. We are strong, but are trying to transition towards corporate governance, which is very important for these entities, that on the institutional front. And as regards finance, we are seeking new financing mechanisms. There is a new arrangement that has been used recently in Colombia, and we have seen this in Colombia, Peru, and in Peru and Panama as well. Bonds, securities that are issued, and there is also a system by which you issue certificates proving that the concessionaire has completed the project, which can then help for future projects. And we are also focusing on environmental issues. We are working with the IDB to try and transition towards a more sustainable infrastructure, setting standards in contracts which reflect the international standards, not just Colombian regulations. And there's a possibility of getting cooperation resources for projects with climate benefits. And on the social front, and regarding our lessons learned, we have built into our contracts a percentage of the project, 0.5% of the capex attributable to each project for social issues. And what is a social issue? Often, infrastructure projects, a road, say, runs alongside communities, which at the end of the day fail to see a benefit, but do see the impact on them. This happens in Colombia. So by using the 0.5%, the idea is for the concessionaire take into account the needs of the community adjacent to the infrastructure project, for the concessionaire to carry out some small public works of a social nature, schools, perhaps football fields, which may be a benefit for people who are not using the road as such, but this helps push along the contractual management of the project. So that's one of the things we are aiming at in our 5G generation of concessions. And for river and railroad transport, there are some risks that we need to allocate in an effective fashion. We are working with the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Transport, as well as the National Planning Department, to have specific guidelines for the projects. Railways and river transport, for, although many years all transport was by river, Colombia being right in the middle of the country, the idea was that communications had to be using either railways or rivers. When roads began to improve, Colombia started to move away from the train and from river transport. But in recent years, and under President Ivan Duque, we have started to turn back to those means of transport as safe and less expensive, and especially more efficient in some ways, because you can send or ship hydrocarbons on the river, or you can bring steel by train, or you can move other non-perishable goods by train. So in the case of river transport, we want to guarantee the navigability of the river 24/7 with stable conditions, the right depth, in a safe way. And in the case of the railroad, the idea is to be able to move freight from the center of the country to the Atlantic coast effectively, cost effectively, and in an environmentally friendly way as well. That is also a package of airport related projects, the largest airports in the country. We are currently in the structuring phase, and of course, there has also been an impact through COVID, but we are trying to put in place more flexible and clear contracts. And the infrastructure projects we are planning are truly vast. In spite of the pandemic, Colombia had very huge passenger traffic growth. So I think I had 5 minutes. I spoke a little longer than that, but that is by and large all of the lessons we've learned during over 20 years of concessions in Colombia. Thank you, Diana. I will have to invite the moderator of the next session to have 2 glasses of Italian wine to make up for the delay. And the center has really focused on PPPs in terms of infrastructure, also investing in education and the fostering of knowledge. We'd now like to hear about the perspective with regard to the region, what you see in other countries, and it would be good to know what you intend to do in the field of education. I'm sure this could be interesting to PPP practitioners in the region. Can you hear me well? Yes, we can hear you and see you. Let me begin by congratulating Mariana, because I think this study has been one of the most significant ones globally with this level of detail. I would have loved to have it 5 years ago when I was in the middle of major discussions with the Minister of Finance of Kenya, when we were discussing the idea that costs would go up due to the requirements in the environmental and other fields. And of course, there's always complaints about cost overruns, among other aspects. And all of these points are so important. What I would like to talk about today is climate change, which is a little different from environmental, social, and property related risks. The hallmark of climate risks is that you don't know exactly what's going to happen over the next 20 to 30 years, which is the duration of infrastructure PPP contracts. If you look at the NASA models or at the Australian or Japanese models, when they go down to the local level infrastructure, there is high variation. So one of the important issues in the case of PPPs is the profound uncertainty in technical terms. We don't know in detail what's going to happen within the next 30 years. We don't know what's going to have with sea levels, but or at least we have an idea. But in the case of droughts and other climate events, we don't know. So in the past, you could perhaps have a forecast of floods, which allow you to think that you could plan for 100 years, but now things have changed considerably and will continue to change drastically. And so will the design of PPP contracts with the private sector, because this will require a sharing of these uncertain risks and dealing with them in a very different way. A second point I would like to focus on has to do with climate change, adaptation, and resiliency. Adaptation is trying to plan what's going to happen and to see how we're going to design the project. And resiliency has to do with preparing the concessionaires or operators for any shocks that may occur, while at the same time being able to continue providing service. And this ties in with what Mariana described. Normally, one would think, okay, insurance will do, but often insurance doesn't solve many of the challenges that you may encounter in PPPs. And insurers might ask for very high premiums because there isn't enough detailed information for, let's say, 30 years. So we need to look at the component of maintenance as part of the contract in detail. If you have clear canals, for example, or dams, that enhances resiliency. The idea is to offer solutions, not only thinking about the actual road or the electricity grid, but you need to think about what's happening in the surroundings. What about the forests? What about the environmental considerations? And how can you build the actual concrete infrastructure and the green infrastructure? How can you harmonize that? We need to also include emergency planning as part of our PPPs, because at the end of the day, these climate shocks will happen with more intensity and frequency. Well, we had references to El Nino and to the hurricanes. So we need to make that planning an integral part of PPPs to also facilitate maintenance. And one complex issue will have to do with the fact that infrastructure projects are often linear, but there might be a failure in the chain, for example, a bridge that collapses, and that requires interaction between the public and private parties. For example, the public party that manages the network and the private party that takes care of the bridge. And we also need to be creative in terms of financial instruments to fund PPPs. Mariana was talking, Diana was talking about new instruments in Colombia, bonds, the catastrophe bonds that are being used by countries in Latin America, for instance. But this has been mainly at the central level rather than at the project level. And I think we need to start laying bridges between those concepts. And a training module for PPP professionals is being organized to enhance their knowledge and to see how to build climate change into the project preparation. I go back to one of the key points of Mariana's report. We need to bring on board the private partner right from the beginning, who will be able to provide perspectives on adaptation and resiliency. And if they're not brought on board right from the beginning, the risks will amplify, things will become a lot more difficult, and the operator will say, no, I wasn't aware of this, this is force majeure, I need to be bailed out by the national or subnational government.
So I think these are key considerations. We need to have a sectoral-based analysis. If you're going to attract PPPs in transportation, for example, or energy, the energy sector, what are the weak links in the network that need to be reinforced in order to achieve greater resilience? Now, this isn't just a problem affecting Latin America. In the United States, with the collapse of, for example, electrical network or a grid because of a snowstorm is fairly common. So these are the kinds of things that are going on. And many researchers in the area of PPPs are focused on concerns, and they're different from the social and land acquisition related challenges. The need to address these climate change factors are going to, I think, make a big impact on how these initiatives will be designed in the future. Thank you. Those are very relevant considerations. We only look at the project usually. And when we know that resilience is something that underlies the whole project, solutions are, as I said, encompass all of these things. So I want to thank everybody. I think we extended beyond our time, but I know we're going to have a lot of questions, and I want to thank, and I'd like to get these experiences and inputs from our panelists, and the topics are very, very relevant in terms of our PPP networks. And we're looking at, for example, the toolkit that we did. And I know this is being acknowledged and recognized as a valuable asset throughout. Claudia, I'd like to offer you the floor as we conclude this session. And again, thank you all for your participation. Thank you.